So this is very rich, and it opens to a very broad spectrum of possible conversations. And I do not want to start engaging into a conversation with you. I would rather leave space to the audience. But just if you could lodge in your mind a couple of considerations. Since you talk about the cost of democracy, if you could elaborate on the consequences. So at the macro level, the overall opacity of political funding in India, but also at the micro level, as you touched in the last part of your presentation, and the filtering effect that money has on politics has an impact on who gets elected, and into a broader conversation about democratization and the diversification of the political class. Clearly, you have a process of homogenization of the political class on the basis of money. And so, if you could, spare some thoughts on, what might be the practical, consequences of that. But before you do that, I would like to open the floor to Q&A from the audience. What I suggest, since I guess there will be a lot of questions, we take bundles of questions, 2, 3, 4 questions at a time. And I would request you to formulate short questions, refrain from making lengthy comments. So,
one question here.
Yeah.
Could you just tell me, say your name, sir?
I am the Vikas partner.
Okay.
What is your opinion about the electoral bonds?
Yeah.
Mr. Donor is anonymous. What is the view?
Sure.
Manisha.
Just very interested with your thing about funding from builders. I'm not surprised, because if you see the Hindi heartland states and you look at their state gross domestic products, they haven't been doing much except building and construction. There's nothing happening in manufacturing. So if this is their GDP, then it's almost near natural that they're funding it this way. Is there state level variation? There are some states where we know that, only some states in India, where building and construction is not the major activity. In states like Bihar, for example, even the government is just doing building and construction. Individuals are doing building and construction. So what's the big story here? Are there variations if states differed in their composition of GSDP? And if we fund out of what we are doing, what's the big thing there?
Okay. Hi, Paro.
This being an election year and all, could you elaborate on
Excuse me, please use the mic.
Hello?
There's a mic coming.
So how might politics in an election year impact the economy and vice versa? What might be some of the economic risk factors that could determine what political policies we might see playing out? Political economy landscape, essentially.
Hi, Milind. I'm Varun Santosh from National Congress.
Hi, Varun. Nice to see you.
So, my two questions. One is, you see a gap between illegal money coming in and spending on legal expenditure. So, is there any quantifying that's happening of the legal expenditure at a larger scale that you come across? Did you build a database for this book? Are there any efforts on that front? Basically, to look at the expenditure front of national parties already visible in legally, right? So that the gaps can be identified in terms of legal source. And two, electoral reforms. I mean, we haven't started discussing on that. So if you could throw some light on that.
Yeah, easy questions, guys. Brief answers. Okay. I'll just try to go in order, I guess. Let me start with electoral bonds. I mean, look, I think a lot of people in this room have more informed views than myself, but I mean, I'm on record as saying, I mean, I think it's a retrograde idea. under the heading of increasing political transparency, you've essentially legitimized opacity. I mean, I just don't understand. Look, if you want to say, does everyone know what electoral bonds are, by the way? I'll just give it like 10-second, I mean, basically the idea is that, you're an entity, you can go to a registered bank, purchase a bearer bond anonymously in any amount at certain times of the year, and then those funds could be deposited in a bank account of a political party, but neither you nor the party has to disclose that transaction. So now, in theory, obviously, the banking regulator would know this has happened, but the public, civil society, the media, the voter has no knowledge of any of this. Whereas, so from the government's perspective, their argument has been, well, this is great because it's everyone has been complaining about this deluge of cash, and so now we've made sure at least it's going through proper, banking channels and so on and so forth. Now, if that was the argument, I think many people would say, well, how do you know that the entity giving you this money is giving you white money as opposed to, right, it could be laundered, right? I mean, there's lots of holes in it, but just say you stipulate to that. Then just say that this is an attack on cash. But to say that this is enhancing transparency, I just don't understand transparency to whom? Because none of us will be any wiser if some firm decides, imagine a state like Goa, where you have a mining firm, and they decide to invest 10,000 crores in the BJP or the Congress, and then the BJP or the Congress come to power and then do a whole lot of favors for the mining company. Is anyone going to be able to know that, right? I mean, so I think in that standpoint, for me anyway, I think it's a missed opportunity because I think there is a big agenda for electoral reform. I actually think that there's a way to couch electoral reform in a way that would be incredibly politically popular, that would be of a concert with some of the things that this government has tried to do, at least rhetorically, if not in the practice. So as far as I'm concerned, and there's a second layer at which electoral bonds may hurt, which is it's not just the entity themselves, it's that I think now there's a public perception that electoral reforms have been done. Tick. So now let's move on to the other agenda items, right? So this whole discourse we've been having, I think now we're going to have to wait quite some time to kind of to push things again. On Manisha's point on builders, so it's actually interesting because what we see is, we're basically able to look at patterns between types of states. And in fact, what we see is that this is actually happening more in urban states than it is in largely rural states. So it's not necessarily the Hindi belt states, right? We're seeing it much more in places like Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and Gujarat, and so on and so forth. We are seeing it much more, and this isn't shocking, we see it more in state elections than in national elections, and I think that's obviously because the state level is the tier at which this is happening. Of course, when in those places, like in Andhra, where you have had several election cycles where you have state and national concurrently, then those two together give you an advantage. The final thing we just tested for, and we didn't actually find any evidence for, was that this effect would be bigger in highly competitive elections, and we didn't see any variation based on the level of competition. So essentially the margin of victory, or the difference between the first place and the runner-up. Gosh, I've scribbled here something on the third question, and now I can't even read my own handwriting. Who asked the third question? Oh yeah, of course, on the political economy. Parul, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not really sure that there's a whole lot of time left to reorient the political economy, right? I mean, I think we saw that this government, on the basis of trends in the rural sector, on the basis of what happened in Gujarat, particularly in Saurashtra, to try to give a kind of rural pro-farmer tinge in the last budget, which is really the last attempt that they have to kind of really rejig spending priorities. I mean, I think clearly we've seen a strong push on the welfare side, so I think we're likely to see Modi Care really dominate the airwaves and the headlines, especially later this fall. A lot of talk about, essentially ramping up or trying to push things which have already been set up. So whether that's Jan Dhan, Swachh Bharat, and so on. Now that the first attempt at privatization of Air India looks like it's completely failed, my contention is that's probably now completely off the table, at least for right now. And remember, because of the oil price shock, right, that roll-off of that windfall that they had gotten is now gone, right? So now the fisc is in an incredibly difficult position. So any major change in priorities at this stage of the game is I think really not on. So so I don't think that's we're likely to change very much. There was a question about electoral reforms, which was Varun. So we have not done any data gathering in this book to try to look at the gaps between declared and actual expenditure. I mean, as you know, actual expenditures is really tough to look at. I mean, what we were able to do in particular places, so there's research in this book from Maharashtra, from Bihar, from Tamil Nadu, where we're able to get some rough estimates of expenditure, right? So in the urban constituency, Maharashtra, that Simone has spent time in, there's a lot of variation. So we're seeing a political party. So, for instance, in the constituency, which is anonymized, the NCP candidates are spending for an assembly election, between 15-16 crores. We're seeing, on the other end of the spectrum, the Shiv Sena spend comparatively less, and his argument is, well, you have more of a cadre, so perhaps there's less need to kind of grease the wheels, with the Congress and BJP someplace in between. And then you go to a place like Tamil Nadu, and you're seeing, orders of magnitude more, right? I mean, figures quoted of, 80, 90 crores for parliamentary elections, and 25 to 40 for assembly elections. So these are huge sums. And meanwhile, what I find is sort of funny is that you go through the official declared expenditure statements of Lok Sabha MPs, and on average, the median victorious MP recorded spending 58% of the limit under law, which they simultaneously complain about as being, far too small.
No, but that's because you have to limit what you declare, and a lot of the big expenditures they can't show like that. Right?
That's right.
Meaning, so if you start showing all your expenditure, even to meet that 15 lakhs, it becomes difficult.
No. I mean, that's exactly right. And there's any number of ingenious ways to sort of get around this, right? I mean, in fact, the thing that we found by interviewing builders was not so much what we might imagine, or at least what I imagined, that there would be sort of suitcases of money, in various parking garages or smoke-filled back rooms changing hands. It was simply, you're given a budget, and tell us what you want to spend money on, and then we make the in-kind contribution on your behalf, right? So you want a media ad buy, we'll take care of that. You have a big printing order, we'll do that. So the actual cash, as it were, never actually exchanges hands. I'll just say one quick thing. I realize none of these are short answers, but I think it's super interesting. Michael Collins, who's a political anthropologist, has a chapter on Tamil Nadu where he has embedded himself within the VCK, which is a small Dalit party in Tamil Nadu, which has an interesting model. So they neither have access to wealthy candidates nor to big business like the other Dravidian parties. So they follow a model of adoption. Basically, their game is every 5 years, they want to be adopted by either the DMK or the ADMK. But the Dravidian parties are very clever. So basically what they do is they will take them on. They want that marginal vote share that will, maybe help them get over the top. But they make sure that any expenditure incurred on behalf of the VCK travels exclusively within their own DMK or ADMK patronage channels. So what that means is that the VCK always remains a kind of stillborn child, right? They're never actually able to grow because none of these benefits of the patronage of the network effects actually redound to that party.
There's a limitation in much of the conversation we have about electoral funding, which is that we tend to focus almost exclusively on what the candidates spend during campaigns, while party funding arguably concentrates the bulk of money available for political activities. And speaking of electoral reforms, if there was one electoral reforms which would be necessary, it would be to make parties accountable for the money that they receive in the first place. The ECI has developed a treasure of innovation and imagination and technology to monitor individual expenses, but doesn't have jurisdiction over what political parties are actually spending and also how they are earning their money in the first place. And the second limitation is that since we tend to look exclusively at the funding of political life or political campaigns, we tend to overlook also the world of expenditures in which politicians permanently float in India the moment you get elected. The moment you get elected, you enter a world of daily expenses, which runs into thousands and thousands of rupees every day, which makes the necessity to raise funds, a permanent feature of political life, and not just building a chest for the upcoming election. So.
Yeah, if I may just add to the point you made about the way political parties function. One is who audits the political parties, and the resistance on the political parties not to have a rotation of auditors or have auditors given to them either by the Controller and Auditor General of India or by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. That's point one. And maybe I'd like your comments also on this whole issue of anonymous donations. You reduced it from 20,000 to 2,000, but is this just a cosmetic change? And the third point on which I'd like your comment is that somewhere in the region of 2/3 of the political parties which are quote-unquote registered with the Election Commission of India, state and central, haven't put up a single candidate in any election. The Election Commission has the power to register political parties, but doesn't have the power to deregister them, which gives rise to the suspicion that many of these so-called political parties are a convenient vehicle for laundering money. Your comments?
I'm Chudi Shivram, I'm a journalist. I'm from Karnataka and we've just seen an election and the drama still goes on. And there are two trends that seem different in this election. One is it brought elections to a new low again, and money so far, what was distributed among the slums and the illiterate, this time was distributed among the educated elite groups also, into apartments, into the kind of professional segments where people openly distributed money. And the rates were fixed. It was 3,000 to 5,000, and so far we knew that the electorate will finally decide who they vote for. But in Karnataka we had little choice because there was no good choice. So the electorate became intelligent. They took money from all sides and voted for the person who paid more. They bargained. The BJP at some places paid 3,000, and they said the Congress party is paying 5 and we vote for them. And second thing about electoral reforms, I really see that not happening, because I was with the election commissioner, deputy election commissioner, on the day of elections. I brought it to his notice about a particular locality where money was being distributed even as elections were on, and he said we can do nothing about it. And all the television channels were beaming all of this, and the election commission kept quiet. So where do you see us heading?
Milan, this is Ananda Bhaskar Rao. You are the global observer. and you are studying the democracies. You are focusing on the electoral economy. When you compare with India, with other nations, where our country is standing in the modesty of the electoral economy, number one. Number two, you have used a great phrase, nationalizing elections, nationalization of elections. In the beginning, in 1952, we were having the elections to Lok Sabha as well as state assemblies together. It is nothing new. And as times passed by, it has proven that it is not possible to go together. And how do you look at the drama of this simultaneous election exercise?
I found your example of the building industry and particularly cement consumption in relation with elections very interesting. So I have a question that if cement consumption actually drops, as you say, at the time of the elections, so would there be another matrix? Then most of these people are in the informal sector, in the construction industry. So would there be simultaneously, alongside the drop in the consumption of cement, would there be people being laid off, and would that have their livelihood consequences? And could that also be another indicator of improving what you're trying to do?
Hi, Amitabh Dubey. Your book and the work I've seen so far looks at candidates and candidate finance. But when it comes to horse trading, which is another growth industry clearly, my crude understanding is that some of this is based on promised shares of extraction from government resources, broadly. Because there's a lot of government spending that happens, and so, that's one source where promises can be made about, if you join the government, you get to do activity A, B, C, D, E. Is this something that the edited volume looks at, or is there any work on this aspect of corruption?
Hi, my name is Siddhant Rao. At the beginning of your presentation, you touched on Modi's plan, perhaps for 2019. Maybe you can just touch a little bit on what Congress's plan might be.
Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. We'll get this man a microphone. So, Paranjoy, great questions. So the first thing is, one of the things which happened in last year's Finance Bill, Finance Act, was previously you could make a contribution anonymously if it was 20,000 rupees or less. That threshold was brought down to 2,000. There's actually some confusion about this because the language is somewhat confusing. So some people believe that the cash limitation has come down from 20 to 2, but anonymously you can still give up to 20. So that's just, it could be a drafting error in the law, but let's just assume that everything comes from 20 to 2. I asked sitting parliamentary representative, how would this change? And I'll just give you his answer, which is more eloquent than my own, which he says, nothing will change. The only thing which changes is the bill I'm going to get from my accountant. Because now he's going to have to make a lot more invoices for me that are falsified. More paper, essentially, right? And so, I mean, obviously the clear reform is any rupee which is given should be disclosed, right? I mean, they could have made that choice, and obviously they didn't. And so you have this $2,000 arbitrary threshold, and whenever you have a threshold that's arbitrary, you're going to give people an incentive to come in sort of right under, right? So I don't think it may make accounting more complicated, but I don't think it changes the fundamental political economy. On the Election Commission, absolutely. I mean, I think the deregistration of parties, even if you look at the authorities that the Election Commission has asked for in order to take action against paid news, right? Even the battle they face in disqualifying candidates who have blatantly violated reporting expenditure norms, we see that those prosecutors bringing those things are very, very, very difficult. Now, unfortunately, in most cases, that would require supplementary parliamentary authority, or lacking that, a chief election commissioner who really wants to push the envelope, which may also mean that you might lose some of these battles in the courts, right? And I think this is depending on the leadership, tends to sometimes be a risk-averse institution. When it comes to the comparative electoral economy, I think it's an excellent question. We start out the book and we end the book by saying, by no means is this an India-specific phenomenon, right? I mean, I can't think of a democracy in the world that doesn't battle with this in some way, right? I mean, even the European governments who adopted in the 50s and 60s systems of public financing, right? I mean, just think about the news in the last couple of months, right? You think about Trump's alleged payoff to Stormy Daniels, right, which is now being investigated as a possible campaign finance issue. You look at the alleged the allegations against Nicolas Sarkozy about accepting campaign money from Gaddafi in Libya. Sorry, well, that was a slip. Apologies, gosh. So I think in any number of places you see this. I mean, obviously, the scale matters, right? I mean, people believe that in terms of absolute amounts, India's parliamentary elections are second only to U.S. presidential elections in terms of the overall quantum of funds being spent. I had written a piece that was critical of electoral bonds, and I got a reply from a bureaucrat in the government who said, I don't understand why you have a problem with this. It just brings us closer to what the U.S. system is. And my response is, since when has the U.S. become a paragon of virtue on political funding, right? I mean, one thing you could say about America's system before is, although we have always had the issue of overwhelming amounts of money being spent, you had a pretty well-regulated system of disclosures, campaign finance expenditures, that you could be, if you were an enterprising journalist or voter, try to connect the dots. And now that level of transparency is going by the wayside, right? Because of super PACs, because of what they're called the 501c4 issue groups, and so on and so forth. So India's scale is bigger. To what extent it's different or worse, is not for me to say, but obviously I think it's a real public policy challenge. Let me just weave in your questions to this. I mean, I think, Devesh and I thought about this, and I think at least 3 or 4 reasons why I think we should care about this and it's having effects, right? So one is very clearly there's a selection effect, right? That unless you are independently wealthy, criminal, a dynass, a tycoon, a celebrity, it's pretty hard to make it in Indian politics today, right? I mean, there is increasingly shrinking space for the proverbial Aam Aadmi to contest. I mean, that's just the fact. And so when you filter candidates down to that level, right, that raises all kinds of questions about how that might shape their policy preferences, how that might shape sort of inequality. So that's one. Number 2 is the obvious quid pro quos, right? I mean, in order to come to office, you raise a lot of funds from people, and then what do you expect it to do in return, right? I mean, it's no surprise that on, the World Bank measure of ease of doing business, that India ranks 185th out of 190 countries on the ease of getting a construction permit, right? I mean, I think the whole builders and politicians story explains that entirely. And the third is the stakes. I mean, if you talk to politicians about, again, getting to the why question, and that's brought out in the book, why are you spending these huge amounts? It's not out of some goodwill. It's because they believe they're going to make that money back with interest when they're in office, right? I mean, so this is an investment decision that they're making, and that's why they're doing it. I don't think there's any other way of kind of looking at it. The last thing I'll say is, Gilles, it raises the question of, political scientists and political theorists have a certain model of the world which states that more electoral competition is a good thing. And this actually raises a kind of interesting counterfactual that it can, is too much competition create a bad thing, right? Because it creates these kinds of perverse incentives when it comes to the sort of arms race-like mentality we see in expenditure. Very quickly, someone said about Karnataka, there's this race in giving handouts. Just very quickly, we'll relate a story from Andhra Pradesh that I saw on the ground in 2014, where a candidate from the TDP, which was the incumbent party, decided, this is all nonsense. Why are we spending so much of our hard-earned money on this vote-buying, gift-giving? So he called a summit of the leading contenders from that constituency, which included the Congress and the BJP, and said, look, this is nuts. Instead of giving $1,000 per voter, let's just give some token amount, and then we'll save us the rest of the money. And so it's a great idea, let's do it. Why didn't we think of this? And then everyone else went about their merry way, and then the TDP guy spent the money anyway, right? And so he won. Now, whether that's because he spent more, we'll never know, but I think it feeds this kind of perception, certainly, that, people are looking for that advantage in terms of spending more. In terms of the Election Commission, I think, we're at a time where this is something Yamini and I are working on, which is we've had a certain mental model of Indian institutions, right? So we've had a set of apex institutions which we have a reasonable amount of trust and faith in. So whether it's the RBI, the EC, the Supreme Court, the CNAG, so on and so forth. We could pick our 4 or 5, but I think most of us could kind of agree on what those are. And then the further down you go the food chain, we start to get a little bit nervous about their efficacy, about their effectiveness, and so on and so forth. I think the events of the last year have forced us to rethink whether that mental model is right? We've seen deep infirmities with the Supreme Court, a lot of questions about the RBI's credibility in the wake of not just the rollout of demonetization, which may have been a political decision, but the way in which they communicated to the Indian public. The Election Commission on any number of fronts, whether it's the election dates in Gujarat, the Office of Profit case, so on and so forth. I think there are questions about what are the steps which need to be taken to renew these institutions. And, one thing which is common in all of these places is the amount of power which has been concentrated in the chief in all of those institutions, right? At the expense of other senior members of those bodies. Simultaneous elections, I don't know if I have a well-informed view of this other than it doesn't smell right to me. I think that just the number of implementation issues, the legal issues, when you have a government, a coalition fall apart or a vote of no, what you do in these circumstances. And I just find the constant political push to suggest that I think there's some ulterior political motive here that's being borne out. By all means, I think we should have a robust debate, and I think we are having a robust debate about it, but I wouldn't put myself in the camp of as being a votary of simultaneous elections. Cement consumption and layoffs, it's an interesting question. One of the challenges we face is just, collecting the data on this. So if you have any leads for us about how we might be able to do that, would love to try. Amitabh, great question. I just haven't, I have not seen any systematic work on this. I think basically your question is, there's a divvying up of ministries based on their relative rent extractive potential. And could you somehow look at this? The only thing I can say is the examples that we're able to call in our book, and this is some work that Sandeep Sutankar and I have also done separately, is, there's clearly a nexus between regulatory intensity and rent extract, which is not rocket science, right? That's pretty obvious. So defense, telecom, mining, right? Anything having to do with land, education. Sandeep has done some really nice work, those who hadn't seen, on the sugar economy in Maharashtra and how that is politically manipulated. But in terms of looking at specific line ministries, I haven't seen. Congress Party. So I'll just say from the outset, the presentation and the comments were delivered from the perspective of what the BJP needs to do. I think in terms of the Congress, I think there's no question that there's an uphill battle. I think Rahul Gandhi's had a good 6 or 9 months of pretty decent PR. I think the question is, whether or not the Congress is going to be able to do 2 or 3 things. So one is, are they going to be able to subordinate their own position in exchange for survival in some of these electorally critical states? And I think one thing which caught everyone off guard, myself included, but certainly Amit Shah and Narendra Modi, was the speed with which they proceeded in Karnataka. Having been beaten to the chase in both Goa and Manipur in terms of electoral government formation, it was the BJP that was caught napping, right? So that tells you that something is going on. Now, they came at a cost of giving up the chief minister position, of giving up the FM, of giving up other ministries, but you could argue that from an electoral survivability standpoint was wise. Whether in UP they'll be able to come to a meeting of the minds in terms of what the right seat share is vis-a-vis the grand alliance that's forming. So I think that's one challenge. We don't frankly know what the answer to that is, and I think we're seeing a lot of pushback from regional parties about, in the past, when you have this motley coalition, you have either the Congress or the BJP form the central pillar. Now, why does the Congress Party think it should be the central pillar this time, given their position both in state and national levels? And I think that's a debate that's going to play out. Really quickly, secondly, I think the biggest task that Rahul Gandhi and leadership have is how do you resolve civil wars that are going on in the Congress at a state-by-state level, right? And I think we've seen, some rather crafty politicking both in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan to try to keep various tents, various camps in the tent, but that's not a one-time thing. That decision, that game is going to get harder and harder the closer we get to elections, because it's going to be about tickets, it's going to be about allocations, so we'll see. And then the third is let's see the platform. I think there are a lot of people who feel like the ground is pretty ripe for an anti-incumbent protest vote. My own feeling is I think that's true, but I think we have a saying that you can't beat something with nothing. So what is that something going to be? And we haven't seen it. Maybe we'll see it. We're still roughly a year out. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Miran. We are slightly out of time. And on UP, by the way, the Congress should start by picking up the phone when the regional parties are calling. Start. So I want to give a last opportunity to talk to Yamini, under whom Milan interned about
many years ago.
Many years ago. I thought you'd been.
She loves hearing that story.
Yes, I know. So Yamini.
Thank you. Milan didn't intern with me, although he says he did. But we had a great time together many years ago. I don't want to take up too much time, but just a couple of two unrelated thoughts in the context of a lot of what you spoke about. One, I think it would be really important to situate the discussion on candidate financing in the conversation on what is happening with party mobilization and in a party democracy. I think part of the reason, in fact, the most critical reason why money matters so much in an election is because party mobilization on the ground often tends to be quite weak, and mobilization in a weak context requires a lot of money. So, maybe we should be asking the question, even on a lot of the very basic expenditure that an MP or an MLA has to have in an election, the sort of payment to the booth workers and so on and so forth, in a context where you have strong volunteers, could those payments be reduced? And would that then, and in a context of robust in a party democracy, would that also then reduce the entry barriers that money bring of money into parties? So I think putting those two conversations together would be quite interesting and important. And a separate thought, on the sort of shifting BJP narrative, I completely agree with you in the sort of move that the BJP has made from the economy, jobs, skills, aspirations, back to good old school welfare. It's an argument I've made as well. And I have at least, and I think to a degree you too, have looked at it from the point of view of the failures of the BJP, which have led them to this change of sort of change of emphasis. But I wonder if there's another way of thinking about it, which is that perhaps the BJP made a big mistake to imagine that in a country like India, you could create an electoral campaign that is divorced from the language of welfare, from the need to bring a strong welfare state. Now, we can argue about whether the current approach the BJP is taking is right or wrong, but could this be a recognition that a strong welfare base is critical in a country as inequitous as India? And could this narrative or could this conversation also feed into the larger concern that people who work on social policy, etc., have, and the sort of big puzzle of Indian democracy, right? Which is, why is it that critical issues, critical public goods, health, education, welfare more generally, doesn't become front and center in electoral politics? Maybe it is becoming front and center in electoral politics, and we're not recognizing it well enough. And the debate should now switch to, which kind of welfare, rather than, whether welfare is relevant or not. It's just something to think about. And also then to move away from constantly reducing welfare politics to populist politics, which is also a very strange dichotomy that public debate has created in India. So I'll just stop there.
Just quickly, 30 seconds, I completely agree with you on the internal party democracy. I mean, one of the things that we do, and Sridharan co-authored this chapter with me and Devesh. Of course, Sridharan, as everyone knows, has thought about these issues probably more than anyone. There is a grand bargain to be had here, right? I mean, in terms of political finance reform. We talk a lot about public financing of elections. And our view was, that conversation is not ripe until you have a certain of conditions on the ground. One would be, as Paranjoy said, some kind of auditing, an independent check on political party accounts. Two is getting rid of this arbitrary threshold of when you have to disclose, not disclose, and just saying it's there, in exchange for loosening, maybe even dropping candidate expenditure limits, because we know that they're pretty meaningless right now. Some stepped up sanction authority for the Election Commission, that when they do detect violations, they're able to act. And then we can start, and the final element is the one you mentioned, is some internal party sort of democracy, right? And I think there we have to tread somewhat lightly. I mean, there's always the question of the sort of nanny state, and we know that how even good intentioned moves tend to get blown out of whack. So, I would just give that caveat. Then we can have a conversation, I think, about public financing and the modalities in which that could proceed. But I don't think, and I think Sri can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing our views, you have to have these as a kind of package. Now, is that going to happen? Not anytime soon, because we're going in the opposite direction. Just one thing on the welfare. I think, I agree with you on the populism. I mean, I had done a paper with a colleague which tried to argue that despite a lot of people saying that economic fundamentals have no relation to electoral outcomes, we actually find that in the decade of the 2000s, there actually is a correlation between, just take growth, GDP per capita of a given state, and how well the incumbent performs. That relationship is not evident in the data between 2000, but it is, and it's not off the charts, but it's significant and consequential. What we're not able to do, and I think this is an interesting research question for anyone who's looking, is why is that there? And there's three possibilities to explain that correlation, and there are sort of three things that begin with P. So one is populism, right? You got this money, you can spend it in a populist fashion, that's a vote getter. Number two is you're spending this money on public goods, so people are actually seeing better roads, better electricity, better water, better health, better education. And the third is poverty reduction, right? That it's actually just a simple income transfer and income effect. We have no idea what's underlying that, right? And I think we're thinking about if this broader relationship is true, and we continue to see that in the data, which of these three P's might it be?
Well, unfortunately, our time is up.
We can
but,
talk after.
But we can talk outside. So, Milan, thank you very much for the precision and clarity of your expose and all of your responses. Thank you to the audience for having turned up in such large numbers. On behalf of partner CPR-TCPD Center for Political Data, we invite you to the third edition of our talk series, which will take place in this room on July 6th. On the theme building a research agenda on the next general elections and on electoral politics in general. So have a very good evening. Thank you very much and see you soon.